everyone, and welcome back to the Covey Wellness Center podcast. I'm your host, Sarah Joy Covey, and I'm excited to be with you here again today for another beautiful conversation in our season 3. And so, as you know, if you've been following along with us, that season 3 of our podcast is interviewing authors, mostly local, although today Summer has come on with us as an exception, and she's at a bit of a distance, but she's still a neighbor, coming to us from the States. And we're excited to talk about her book in the series of discussions that we're having. And so Summer Gross is the author of the Emmanuel Promise, Discovering the Security of a Life Held by God. And this is a book that looks at the intersection of attachment theory and spiritual connection. And so, as many of you know, this is the space that I like to live most of my therapeutic work and life, and to speak into. And so I just am so excited about this conversation with Summer because I really believe more of these types of conversations are needed, and more of these intersectional spaces to open up our spiritual exploration and also our awareness of these tools that are so helpful. And so I'm just excited to have Summer with us. And so she's going to unofficially welcome her to the podcast, but also ask her to just tell us a little bit about herself and the work that she does. And then we're going to get into talking about the book.
Yeah, so I'm an Anglican priest of 20 years and a spiritual director of about 10 years. And I find a lot of my work happens in groups or in online groups, online spaces called the Presence Project. But I love sitting down with folks and hearing their stories and listening deeply and finding out where their spiritual life got its foundation. So I love hearing kind of some of the backstories of people's lives. But when I started learning about attachment, I had a teacher at Healing Care Ministries, which happens around Ashland, Ohio, or Columbus, Ohio. And her name is Dr. Ann Halley. And this was about 12 years ago. And she did a large teaching, a full day teaching on attachment theory and how she would take each one of her spiritual directees through an attachment interview.
Wow.
Asking them questions about their attachment to help her understand their story of their spiritual life going forward. So it's been a 12-year process of being fascinated with it for other people, but also for myself.
Wow.
Because as we know, attachment, that the early years, those early 3 years with the caregiver builds a sense of security for all the relationships going forward.
Isn't that profound?
It is.
Right? Yeah.
It's so profound, and it's beyond like Enneagram or that kind of information, which is is put together. It's a lot of common sense kind of information. This is scientific. This is how the brain, how the neural pathways were developed for relationships going forward, but also the relationship with God.
So fascinating. So had you done any work with attachment theory prior to that introduction? Was it brand new to you at that point, or you kind of heard about it that kind of opened your eyes to this whole new lens to put on this relationship? Is that fair to say?
I think it was pretty brand new at that point for me. I probably had heard it tossed around a little bit, but this is 12 years ago, and there weren't a whole lot of people making that connection between attachment theory and the spiritual life. And so to hear her practical ways of bringing it into the spiritual direction relationship just blew me away. Was very interesting to me.
And you were starting if I'm realizing your timelines correctly as you shared them, you were just starting into a spiritual direction lane for yourself. And so this was a tool that you were learning about and seeing how it could be so deeply integrated, which is fascinating. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about maybe define the term spiritual formation and spiritual direction, because I think there may be lots of people who, I mean, I know what they mean, and we may have different versions of what they mean, but there may be lots of listeners who maybe just don't even know what we're talking about when we talk about, that this book is about your spiritual formation and through, an attachment theory lens, and what spiritual direction is all about. What is that? Can you tell us that?
Yeah, sure. So spiritual direction, I'm a little bit more clear on a definition around that. It's actually not very directive in a lot of ways. It's much more about listening and listening deeply to someone's story and being a companion. The Celts have a term of anam cara, which is a soul friend. And so
Yes.
it's really a training of how to be a soul friend, how to come alongside. One of my other favorite metaphors for this is the way John the Baptist talked about himself as
Okay.
the friend. He called himself the friend of the bridegroom.
Okay.
So there was a sense of almost like a matchmaker type
Right.
space, or even marriage counselor space.
Right.
For me, it's very much kind of a marriage counselor space. And
Yes.
listening to the desire of the person who's in front of me for their hunger for relationship, what they
Okay.
desire their relationship to look like. And then helping to see some of the hindrances in that. But also, on the other hand, I don't know if you've ever come across the book, The Critical Journey.
I have heard of it. Yes. I haven't read it, but it's on my list.
Yeah,
Yes.
it is. If you are at all interested in this spiritual journey, I really suggest reading this book. It's by Janet Hagsberg, and I think she's the main editor on this. But essentially, they put this spiritual journey into 6 different seasons,
Yes.
and how people can get stuck in one of those seasons, how churches help or hinder in
Different
those
seasons.
seasons,
Yes.
and what happens when we get stuck in a season. And I believe that spiritual directors are there to be really good listeners to those spaces in which we are stuck, but also to find the golden threads of what
Yes.
God is doing already, and kind of pull on those threads so that in the middle of our session, we can see all the gold of what God
Mm.
has done already. I heard from someone yesterday that they had, that there was some type of questionnaire to folks of how they felt God felt about them.
Okay.
And like 90% of the young people that were questioned felt like God was disappointed in them. And
Wow.
that just broke my heart.
Yes. Yes. Wow. It's so interesting because, and we can get into this certainly, and I'll have you speak to it, but we do form these narrations of our lives and these stories that are telling us the meaning, whether we're doing that consciously or not. There are stories that are running, and there are stories about God, and there are stories about how God feels about us or how God's going to act. They may not even be conscious stories, but then when there's a illumination of that to say, well, how is it then that sense of like God is disappointed with me? What does that reveal about our understanding of who God is?
Exactly.
And, how maybe that story needs some redemption.
Right.
And that's where, again, I think that soul friend can step into a space and cultivate that curiosity and a different, ask a good question, to point in a different direction, to illuminate something, so that starts to shift and be more about, I think, who you and I do believe God is, who is someone who I think Brendan Manning says has a furious longing to be in relationship with us, right? Who's pursuing us, who sees us as the beloved, and so what would it mean if that was the story that came into play in my relationship with God, rather than this one of disappointment or whatever that might be, or judgment, or any number of other things. So that's fascinating. I wonder if you could also, maybe just before we go into this a little deeper in how the book deals with this, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about attachment theory. Again, some of our listeners may not be familiar with that language, that theory. Would you be comfortable just giving us like a high level, this is what we're talking about? It's in the first 3 years of life. It impacts our formational journey and how we relate to other people in that very, very vulnerable and important time. But maybe just broaden that out for us a little bit, so people have an idea.
Well, let's do this. Since you're the therapist, we'll do this a little bit together. But here's the core of what I understand attachment to be. So essentially, attachment is received through thousands of interactions of loving care. So a strong attachment is received that way. The look of delight, the kindness in someone's voice, the warmth of being held, the milk from the mother, and even that, what did they say? Like 10-inch movement from eye to eye when the child is breastfeeding. Like those sensory moments over thousands of interactions are what ends up building a sense of attachment. Also, what's needed is when a child cries, they have an expectation of care.
Yes.
So in order to build that secure attachment, that expectation of care has to be strong. And none of us are perfect parents, of course. They say that that expectation of care needs to be met at least 60% of the time in order for a secure attachment to be built. So many of us were not given a secure attachment. There was just something off about those 3 years for us. Either a parent was not able to give that kind of loving care consistently.
Right.
Or there was trauma involved. So there's 3 different types of attachment, or 4 different types of attachment. There's the secure attachment, as you know.
Yes.
Insecure, anxious attachment, insecure, avoidant attachment, and insecure, disorganized attachment.
Yes.
And something that I'm interested in, and maybe you can say what you know about this, but what I'm interested in is the insecure, anxious child still believes that if they yell loud enough, if they do things right, that the attachment will come to them. There's still a bit of hope. The insecure, avoidant child has lost hope, and they've become insular and realize that they can only meet their own needs. And so they are afraid that their parent is going to treat them with what's called still face, which I think is absolutely fascinating too, that so many of us on our phones, focus on our phone, are not realizing that what we're doing is we're really giving our child still phase, that
Right.
they are wanting interaction, eye to eye connection with us, and we are elsewhere just through
Yes.
little
Distracted. Sure.
devices. But so that's insecure, anxious, insecure, avoidant. The child believes that they're on their own, that they have
Mm-hmm.
to care for themselves. And then insecure, disorganized has to do with some type of trauma that the child has experienced or seen that caregiver give to someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so they've lost trust. So there's a
Right.
sense that I still have to come to you in order to receive food. Like I still need things. So I
Yes.
still have to come to you, but I don't know if you're safe.
Mm. And is it fair to say, and this is my understanding, that it can feel in that disorganized, like very unpredictable for the person who experiences that, and someone in relationship with someone with a disorganized attachment style is going to experience them as wanting to draw close and then wanting to move away. And it doesn't make sense sometimes to other people because we don't have these lenses, maybe, and the understanding to put on them to say, oh, this actually does make sense based on their early childhood experiences and what they viewed or what they had or didn't have in terms of that loving care and interaction and consistency. And so there's just so much to this, and we'll put a link in the show notes as well, so people can go to an attachment resource and kind of explore it as well for themselves and look into it, because we certainly won't do justice in our conversation today to the full extent of this. But I think it does speak to, again, these pieces that we're putting together neurobiologically in that time are then forming a framework for how we move beyond that time. And so let's jump in then, if you can, a little bit on what can that look like? So, for someone, I don't know if it's helpful to go through each type or just in general, where can we see that attachment styles are coming up in our lives? Where will we notice that?
I think first we'll notice that in our interactions with our partner, with our spouse, that those same ways of functioning in our early caregiver relationship will more than likely come up again in that marriage relationship.
Right. And so let's just talk about maybe practically, if you're wondering what we sort of have a sense, I think intuitively, I often say to my clients when I'm working with couples, I often will ask them, what do you think healthy relationships would do in this situation? And they may not be in a healthy relationship in that moment or in that particular circumstance, but usually they can kind of get to, well, they would communicate without yelling at one another, and they would collaborate together, and it would feel safe for them to share their feelings. Like they sort of intuitively, and I think they often go to that secure attachment, equals healthy relationship. They're not using that language maybe, but that's kind of what they're describing is it's okay for me to be myself. I feel like I can say no. I feel heard and seen and supported in the decisions I'm making, and all these things that speak to that sense of we're attuned with our partner, we're in sync with them. And that cliche piece that we often say, you hear this in sitcoms and the like about coming from couples therapy, but like, I see you, I hear you, and for me, I often will say we're all looking to be seen and heard and to feel that sense of withness. I'm with you. I see you. I hear you. I'm with you. And there's an attunement that comes with that kind of secure connection. And so I think we often kind of know what it could look like, what it should look like, what it might look like if it was healthy. And I should also say maybe, and you clarify if this is a different understanding for you, but my understanding is that there's a lot of movement in how we relate to people. It's not like it's static. Like if we can move in and out of a secure sense of attachment and more into an anxious sense, that it's it's not fixed. That there is hope to learn and move into secure attachments, of course. And that's what we're talking about in the book, that it's possible, but also that we're not, it may not show up in every relationship in the same way, because certain things might feel more secure in certain relationships than others, and see those styles. So I want to just be careful not to sort of put everything in these nice, neat quadrants, because people's relationships are complex. But you might notice then that if you're not doing, let's say, what you think a healthy relationship might do, if you're not communicating with love and grace and compassion, it might lend itself to a curiosity to say, okay, could that be related to an attachment style? Is there something that I'm bringing into this exchange that makes me feel as if I don't have support and I have to do it on my own? Or I need to keep striving and striving and striving to prove that actually I am loved? Or that sometimes I feel like that very profoundly, and other times I feel like I just have to protect and step away. And I think we could relate to moments of that, maybe even seasons of that in our primary relationships, right? Where it shows up, and how that can shape how we're able to navigate those relationships, right? With a degree of health or with a degree of challenge in them. What would you say to that? Does that make sense, what I've described?
Yeah, definitely. I think that what I understand is that we often have different attachment relationships with different caregivers too. Like there's a primary caregiver that ends up creating the primary attachment style, but that like my relationship with my dad was different. And so to recognize that maybe we created a different sort of pattern with a different person that was close to us.
Yes.
And that one is accessed, by our response to an action in our relationship with them. We respond similar to that rather than similar to our original caregiver. So yeah, I do believe that we're very complex. But also that this can be a key because we're born fairly tabula rasa without the relationship structures. We can talk about epigenetics or something like that another time. But for the most part, we're born without the neural pathways for relationship, and all of these interactions that actually form our way to give and receive love.
Yes, that's right. So even that lens to say, is there an attachment piece? Is there an attachment lens? As you could say, where are there barriers to my giving or receiving of love? Am I noticing that? And, am I finding it hard to love someone else? Am I finding it hard to receive the love from someone else, or to understand what that feels like or looks like? And that might be an indication that this would be something you'd want to explore, of course, with someone who might be able to guide you through that, of course, and also, to know that awareness would help you then move to the place that you're longing for, which I think for all of us is that beloved place. And so, whether that's in our partnership, or as I want to move to, in our conversation, our relationship with God and what that looks like, and how our sense of those early formational years of neurobiological development into certain ways of relating and our ability to give and receive love. How do you see that relating to the relationship with God? So we might see it in our partnerships, we see it in our children and other aspects, but let's move that to the spiritual lens, because that's what you got into in this beautiful book, and really thinking about how does this shape that spiritual relationship with our Heavenly Father. Can you talk about that some more?
Yeah, so this is what kind of stirred up in me as I was asking the question for the first time. We are, those of us who are Christians, who have desired to become a Christian and to be baptized, there's language in scripture about adoption. There's language in scripture about becoming an adopted child of God. And so I started jumping into a lot of adoption literature and learning a lot more about how difficult it can be to form a bond in that new relationship with a new parent, and with already having a structure that you're bringing into that, already having an attachment that you're bringing into that relationship, and then how that new attachment gets formed. So I started learning a lot about that. There's a story in the book about a young woman, or a young girl, I think she was about 10 or 11 at the time, who was brought home from Ethiopia. And here she had 10 years in an orphanage of experience of caregivers coming and going.
Right.
Not being able to depend upon them, struggling for food security at times, and struggling to feel like she had security. And so when she came home with our dear friends here in this area, she wasn't able to sleep without her new mother.
Right.
She was afraid that as soon as she fell asleep, that her new mother would
abandon her.
Right. That it was a feeling of abandonment. So it took a long time for them to learn how to help her to establish the new truth that this mother was going to be there in the morning.
Right.
And was going to be able to meet her needs in the morning.
And be dependable.
Yes.
And yes.
Yeah, that this was a new structure of being able to, of cry and response, that this mother was going to be able to be there. So they came up with an idea of stringing like a clothesline above this little girl's bed, and this mom throughout the night would sneak in and put little pink hearts on this clothesline to let this little girl know that her mom had been thinking of her at this moment and at this moment and at this moment throughout the night. And eventually she was able to sleep knowing that her mother was going to be there. We think about that.
Wow.
There's a similarity, isn't there, to that story of the Holocaust, of the children who weren't able to sleep because of food insecurity, and the elders in their bunk room or wherever they were would give them a crust of bread to fall asleep with.
Right.
So that
they could rest.
Yeah, that they were going to be taken care of in the morning. And I think that's what we're talking about quite a bit with God, because there's a lot of folks that have a sense that someone else's needs out there are more important. Someone else has cancer, someone else is in a war zone, and my needs are not important. So I'm not going to cry out to God, and I definitely don't know how to receive his loving care.
Right.
So how can I be in this new relationship feeling seen and heard and cared for by my new adopted parent?
Yes. That's so fascinating. And that's so interesting that you took that lens of adoption, of course, which is such biblical language, but really looking at it from the standpoint of what does that feel like to be adopted into the family of God and to find our place and that crawling up into the lap of Abba Father, and that security there, but then also that security when not sitting in that lap, and feeling like that freedom to move and return. I think that's so much of the attachment, right? So if I move away, I can return. And it doesn't change if I'm not, physiologically attached, right? The attachment is secure if I go over and play over here in the room for a while and then I come back. And so I wonder what you notice in maybe your work as a spiritual director with people who are maybe newly adopted or navigating their adoption in the family of God, and what are some of the messages they are learning in that. Like, I'm just curious about what comes up for people as they have this lens. They think about, it takes me a bit to trust that God is there for me. God is putting those hearts on that, little clothesline, at different points, that he is with me, that he sees me. Like, maybe not being able to trust that initially because that was not the pathway that you had. Yeah, just talk to me a little bit about people's journeys, that maybe some stories you'd want to share about navigating that.
Yeah, that's interesting. So trust, one of the things that we know about trust comes from a sense of security, an embodied sense of security, not just an information-based sense of
Yes.
security. So
Yes.
we can know a whole lot of information about God, just like we might know about, say, a father that goes out often on military trips or something like
Sure.
that. Like he has to be I'm not thinking of the right language right now, but
Deployed, I think you were.
deployed often.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, he has to be deployed often. And so there is a sense that people tell you about who they are, but that
Mm-hmm.
you don't know them personally.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of folks struggle with that sense of that experience with God, that they know a whole lot of facts about him through scripture. They know a whole lot of facts about what they've been told, but there's not an embodied sense of trust that as I go through seasons of pain, of suffering, of fear,
Mm-hmm.
that God will be with me,
Mm-hmm.
comforting me and giving me security throughout those seasons.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that difference between, I love that word embodied. I feel like that's a word we're talking about more and more, which I think is so important, because it's that sense of we can have an intellectual knowledge of, we can have an intellectual knowledge of someone's presence, but not a felt knowledge of that presence, not an experiential knowledge of that presence. And so I think what we're suggesting here is that attunement, that witness, that attachment to God really becomes so profound when you have that felt sense of presence. It's not that when I'm crying, that I am surrounded then by the loving presence of God, by the comforter, by that I'm attended to in
Right.
that call for
Right.
help. And it's hard to describe that. I feel like I'm looking for words, but it is so experiential and it's so personal,
Yeah.
right?
And I think you're using the right language of attunement. What
Yes.
we're talking about is not just having information about someone, but the attachment comes from the other person. That's what I think is so interesting about attachment too. It's not something we can create. It's
Right.
actually coming from the other towards us.
Right.
What's interesting about, I think, Psalm 23 and why we love Psalm 23 so much is because we are seeing an attached person in their
Okay.
process. So we're hearing David say, the Lord is my shepherd. He tends to me.
Mm-hmm.
He provides for me. He provides food and water. He takes care of me when I need rest. He restores my soul.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I go through difficult seasons, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. And instead of saying, the Lord is my shepherd, he turns to you. He says, you are with me.
Right.
So there's a sense of presence. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. So there's a sense of like even touch with that.
And protection that feels,
protection and
security.
hemming in. That sense of hemming in. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And then a sense of belovedness. You set a table before me in the presence of my enemies. So in a moment that I would usually be crying out, you're pouring out your love and your care, and your provision at that moment. And giving me the sense that I am yours, pouring oil on my head. So there's very sensory, there's embodied words all the way through this. And then at the end is this profound word that is found very few other places, and I'll talk about that, but that your love and your goodness will follow after me. Some people say follow. It's actually pursuit. It's an intense, devoted pursuit that in a word that's only ever used in a military term, a military pursuit kind of term. That's how much God pursues us with that kind of single-minded devotion.
Wow.
So we see his attachment, and we hear that David is a man after God's own heart, that he's good at crying out before God. What I love about the Psalms is that he's very good at connecting to his emotion that's in him, whatever that is. I mean, he talks about rumination. He talks about depression. He even talks about jealousy. He talks about all of the human range of emotions, and then he directs it towards God.
Yes.
In all of those. And then we use that to learn about prayer.
Yes.
That's what God wants us to know about prayer, that he wants us to bring our heart's deepest cry to him, and then to bring it before him and to experience him coming and taking care of us in that place.
And that speaks to the security of that invitation, which is you can be your full self as you are,
right, and
come, and your belovedness is not dependent on, I often think of David if you looked at him as a character, like a moral example of character, like he's a really flawed human person, but he knew his belovedness, and he knew he had that embodied connection with God. And so that invitation to us is to be in our humanness. That's not thinking about that disappointment comment of all the people feeling God's disappointed with us. It's our humanness and our failings and our challenges and our raw common humanity is not at odds with God's ability to love us. It's not putting us outside of God's love. He's actually saying, this is a secure relationship for you to step into, and your cries will be heard, and you will be attended to, and you will be comforted and loved. And it's hard. Again, it's just hard to imagine how profoundly beautiful that invitation is. And that embodied awareness as people experience that,
It really is profound that God would invite our full selves, however we are, into his presence.
Mm.
And then, unlike our human caregivers that could only be in one place at one time and
Right.
only had a certain amount of capacity, he says, I have infinite capacity to hold your needs with tenderness. He has
Yes.
ability to handle that person's need as well as my angsty Thursday needs today. He is
Yes.
able to carry them, and he doesn't say, oh, those needs are more important for me. I'm going to be over there. So I
Mm.
think that's what a lot of Christians do is they have a sense that they have to weigh their needs on a scale of importance before they bring them to God.
Right. Like, is this enough for me to reach out to God, or should I just handle this on my own?
Exactly.
And so, of course, in the attachment lens, the relationship that is securely attached would say, of course, I want to hear about how that's impacting you. It doesn't have, you don't have to, it doesn't have to be a catastrophe before you come to me. I just want to be in your life. I want to be with you. I want your life to be witnessed. I want it to be known. And I want you to feel that freedom of sharing in this relationship together. So, yeah, so that's a really wonderful word to people. So, I mean, one of the things that you talk about is that rootedness in order to, weather the storms and feeling like this relationship with God is an anchor for your soul in those times that you can draw on. And I think that a lot of people who might be listening to this, if they're not going through a season like this right now, they may have gone through one recently. I mean, we're often coming in and out of our lives of seasons of struggle, and that's the human experience. And so I wonder, what's the invitation, what's the encouragement to that person from this lens, from the book, that could speak to that person in a storm of life,
Yeah. Well, I would say if you're not going through a major trauma right now or a major struggle right now, that this is actually a really good time to start practicing that cry and response and receiving from God. There's some beautiful practices like Emmanuel journaling that I feel like is one of the most beautiful ways of experiencing the attunement of God in our everyday life. There's experiences like Ignation Imaginative Prayer, where we enter into a gospel story and we bring our full selves into that moment of that story, and we encounter the living Christ. And then we also kind of bring up the pain of our present moment and allow the Lord to tend to us in that place. So there are a ton of practices at the end of this book that help us to build those kind of attachment. And it's not build, is it? It's receive.
Right.
Because the Lord desires to give this. It's just
Yes.
that creating essentially what we're doing is we're creating space.
Yes.
We're getting silent enough, or we're just coming towards God. I love that Revelations 3:20 scripture of I stand at the door and knock. And whoever opens the door to me. So God is already knocking. He's already saying, I'm ready for your bid for attachment.
Yes.
All you have to do is push open the door. I've come with a picnic basket.
Yes.
I've come with the bread and the wine. Let's eat together. I'm ready at all times. I'm always knocking. I'm always ready.
I love that. It's reminiscent. A group this came up interestingly. It's coming to mind again in a group that I had led through the Lenten series. talking about, there's a picture, and I'm trying to remember the painter's name, but it's an old picture of Jesus at the door.
Yeah.
And it was such a cool
The lantern.
experience. Yes, with the lantern. And the facet that was so interesting is the person was sharing about how her grandmother or something had shared. I can't remember precisely who it was, but I think it was the grandmother or something had shared, that, God was that sentiment that he's always knocking, he's available, he's right outside the door. And you just need to invite him in, and there may be lots of barriers related to attachment as to why it's hard to receive that love. And those are things that can be worked through and overcome. There is hopefulness in that, but that it sounds like it's so easy to just open the door for God to come in and dine and be with us. But that can be a difficult thing. But what was so fascinating was that picture is hanging in my kitchen. So I'm on this group and they're talking. I said, I know that picture. I brought it in off my wall into the group. And they're like, that's the picture. And I said, what's so interesting is there's no doorknob. I don't know if you've ever noticed that there's no doorknob in that picture. And so it cannot be forced entry. It cannot be opened by Jesus to push himself in. The image is that it has to be opened from the inside and welcomed. That it's a knock, but I'm not going to force myself into your space. You open that welcome. And so I think that's also, speaks to secure attachment, right? It's not an expectation. It's an invitation. It's not a forced, I'm coming in to your space when you don't want me there. It's, I'm here. And when you are comfortable and ready, I will enter. And you are, and I feel like that is so beautiful. I just, it's so interesting that picture's coming to mind again. It is in my kitchen, so I do love the picture, but just that God's presence is there and available at our invitation to it. It's a shared invitational space, I guess. That's so neat. Wow. Is there anything else that you would like to, I know we're coming to the end of our time together. Is there anything else that you would like to share with people about how the book might encourage them or speak to them? I love the practicality of that. You've mentioned how many really beautiful spiritual tools and practices that can help build those muscles. Our formational journey, and our practices, they're not about gaining the love of God, but making space and posturing ourselves to receive that love. So that's and it is such a great resource that way. Is there anything we haven't shared that you'd want to say to a potential reader or to someone to kind of give them a sense of your hope from this book for them?
I think a lot of us have been given a vision of God, which is scary, which is angry, which is disappointed in us. And we have no idea how much he is passionate about being in our presence. That's one of the things that is so interesting about Psalm 139. It says that God's eyes were on us even in the womb. Before we even had consciousness to turn towards him, he was already turned towards us.
Yes.
And so God was practicing your presence long before you could begin to practice his presence. And when you turn towards him, when you begin to open up that door, he's already there. He's already just waiting to be in your presence. Your presence is just as important to him as his presence is to us. And so the moment that you spend time in one of these spiritual practices or push play on one of the practices that I have at the end of every chapter on my website, God's right there. He's so excited to spend time with you. He's eager for a connection with you. Not just for correction. I think so many of us are in churches that are all about behavior and not about relationship.
Yes.
But until we know that we're the beloved of God, correction is going to feel like shame, and
Mm-hmm.
it's going to feel like separation. Where
Mm-hmm.
instead, I believe that when we do have moments of correction, that it's just an invitation closer. And it's an invitation to, this is how I formed you. This is where more freedom is.
Mm.
Let's walk this direction. Let's unbind you, like to Lazarus. Let's unbind you and let you go.
Wow. I wonder if you could just speak for a moment to the title.
Mm.
So, and just for people who may not maybe make the connections from there, but what does it mean, the Emmanuel Promise? What does
Yeah,
that?
so this was one of the pieces of attachment that was so interesting to me is that over time, as a child knows that they are loved, they begin to carry that sense of love even when their parent is out of the room.
That's right.
So the Emmanuel promise, Emmanuel means God with us.
Mm-hmm.
And so we sing about it around Advent and it becomes almost like a cliche. But what if we were to know, oh yeah, he is always within earshot. He is always
Mm-hmm.
present, attentive, responsive, and engaged towards us. His face
Yes.
is always turned towards us. What if we were to live that way? Then an attachment is a possibility because you can't be attached to someone who's not available.
Right. Right. So this is the promise of God with us.
Right.
Right. Yes.
This is the first stage to attachment. We have to know that he's available to attune to us
Mm-hmm.
when we cry out.
Wow. He's not far at any point. Right. Wow, this has been such a rich conversation. And I'm so thankful. And I just think there's so many pieces that people will consider and hold and think about and carry forward from this time. I'm so thankful for it. I know as part of our wrap up in this season, we're asking, a sort of a fun question of our guests. And so we will wrap with that. But just before we do, can you tell people, Summer, where they can find you and connect with you? And where's the best way to follow along with the work that you're doing in the world? And of course, for those of you who are driving or listening and don't have your notebook, we'll have all this in the show notes for you as well. But where's the best place to connect with the work that you're doing? The Presence Project you mentioned, but let's speak a bit about that.
Yeah. So I'm on Instagram at Rev Summer Joy, but it's on the Presence Project that I get to have the most fun. On about twice a month, I have a retreat called Table of the Beloved that people show up and I do teaching on these subjects and do spiritual practices together. And
Wow.
then, so that happens every single month or twice a month. And then I have spiritual direction groups for those who need others to kind of walk alongside them in their journey. We're on Facebook as well in the Presence Project. But the most, and I have a podcast called the Presence Project Podcast. And if you're interested in listening, start at number 1.
Okay.
Start at the very beginning because I start with some of these tools and kind of explain the attachment. Yeah. Build from there. Mm-hmm.
So the Presence Project, that's where you're going to find Summer. Those are the important words to remember in all the places. And then she has some beautiful resources. She's already alluded to some of the resources that are on her website that go along with the chapters in the book. And so they're available. And there's just some really beautiful points of intersection for you on this journey of wanting to press into more of God and understanding how that informs and how you live. It's beautiful. So The final question we're asking everyone, and we can go whatever direction you like with this, but is we know that our authors, our readers, I can see behind you there for those of you who are listening, of course, because we mostly do audio. There's a great big, beautiful bookshelf. My bookshelves are full on either side. Those of us who like to write and read, it's connected. I just wonder what is currently on your bedside book stack. So we have this theory that everyone has a book stack who is a reader beside their bed of things that they're working through that are inspiring them. You mentioned the critical journey, and we'll definitely note that one as well. But what is on your heart and mind these days? And it could be, it doesn't have to be anything in particular. Just curious what's on your bedside book stack.
So, if you're interested in along the same pathway, then Dr. Kurt Thompson's book, Anatomy of the Soul, is just
so good.
Really, really rich. And I would suggest that you start there. I have been adoring a book series that's called The Unsolicited Journals of Emma M. Lyon. And it's still being written. It's being written by Beth Brower. It's funny. It's thoughtful. There are moments of talking about grief and friendship, but it's supposed to be like the 1880s and a young woman who is nearing her inheritance. But this particular author is so hilarious. It's also very clean.
I love that.
But I just gave the whole stack of them to another friend, and she's like, I can't stop reading these. They are so much fun. So I love telling people about Beth Brower's fun series. They're even good for high school girls or high school students.
Wow. Because
they're so clean.
I love that. And I love the joy of, the readership, because sometimes I know for me, I can collect, we have the bookshop here, we collect all the books, we're talking about those books, but then I have this joy in novels. I'm reading the Irish Country Doctor series, and there's a number of them, and it's just wholesome and delightful, and just the joy of engaging with books. So that's such a wonderful gift as well. So I've never heard of that series. So now you've given me potentially a really great summer read. But it sounds like I better not start until I'm ready to spend some time at it, because I'll be hooked. So
perfect for vacation.
Perfect for that. Yes. And my daughter's a big reader too. So maybe we would share those. Well, thank you again for your time today, Summer. We just really appreciate your insight and your gift of time and presence with us here today, and for this beautiful book. I know it's going on the shelves here at the Wellness Bookshop, and that would be available for people who want to press in deeper to this and access those great tools and resources and use this lens and in their formation journey. And so we're just so thrilled to have it here and to raise it up as a resource in this space. So thanks again. And for those of you who maybe have heard some of this today and you want to press in deeper to that spiritual part of yourselves, or maybe you're curious about that, or perhaps you are recognizing some of these patterns of attachment that may or may not be in the spaces that you would hope, or you're noticing things out of our conversation that you think, well, that's curious. I'd like to understand that more and see if I could move in a new direction with that. That's why we are here at Covey Wellness Center, to support you in that journey and to guide. And so we would love to be a soul friend to you as well through this journey. And so we would invite you just to reach out and for support and start that process. We always want people to know that there are resources available for them, and that people are here to love them through what can be a hard journey related to attachment. And so please do not hesitate to reach out through the website. I think you know where to find us, covey-wellness-center.com. And there's an easy contact us form. And so until next time, when we join together, thanks for listening in. Please do share this with someone who might find it helpful. We're happy to spread the word and to have these resources and conversations available to encourage And so again, thanks to Summer and thanks to our listeners, and we'll see you at the next show.